the fourth in our roadmap series. A warm welcome to all the wonderful speakers we have today, and a special welcome to our VIP panelists, Dr. General Venkatesh, Dr. Ravi, and soon to join Dr. Madhuri. We had to actually have our Indian Medical Association National President giving us the inaugural address, but he has been called away for an urgent meeting with the Ministry of Health, probably relating to the pandemic. So we have his blessings and we continue. And let's kickstart by doing a brief overview of what IMA D4D stands for, as well as what we plan to do today. As if most people who have attended earlier seminars or are part of IMA know about D4D, the Doctors for Doctors initiative. And during the pandemic, we have switched from face-to-face workshops and conferences in medical colleges to this Zoom platform. Actually, in a way, it's given ability to reach further and deeper into all the colleges across India, because the IMA Medical Students Network and the IMA Junior Doctors Network are collaboratively working with our IMA D4D. And today, as I said, it's the fourth among this roadmap series. We started this somewhere soon after the pandemic hit us. And the roadmap series stands for an acronym, and R was for resilience, O was for optimism, A was for attitude, and today we have D. D stands for wonderful qualities like determination, dedication, devotion, duty, and many more. And we have 8 wonderful speakers from first MBBS to recently retired doctors who are going to share how such qualities and other positive attributes help them to face and overcome and continue to face challenging situations in their life. I would like to start by extending a warm welcome to General Venkatesh, and a small introduction for him is necessary. I could talk for a long time, but I think it's important to give a brief snapshot of his achievements. So may I please have the slide for Dr. General Venkatesh? He is a person I've known for many years, and for all his achievements, he still remains a very humble and wonderful human being. He is currently the Vice Chancellor of the Manipal University. He has himself been an ENT surgeon, and he was Dean as well as Commandant of the Armed Forces Medical College. A warm welcome to you, General Venkatesh. And I'm sure you'll add a lot of value to us. You have been supportive of this D4D initiative and encouraging to me. Thank you very much, and thank you for being with us today.
Thank you very much. I feel it my privilege to be part of this panel today.
Welcome. I would like to go on to introduce Dr. Ravi Wankhedkar. Dr. Madhuri has not yet joined us, so we'll give her introduction a bit later. Dr. Ravi Wankhedkar doesn't need introductions in the IMA family. He has been a past president, national president of the Indian Medical Association, and during his presidency of the IMA, this D4D initiative took birth. And he continues to be a supporter and a mentor for our team, IMA D4D. Thank you, Dr. Ravi. I know how busy you are, being the treasurer of the World Medical Association and president of the SARC Medical Association. You have a very, very tight schedule, but thank you for being with us. And I'm sure you will be adding wonderful, positive energy to this event.
Thank you. Thank you, Nilima.
Just for sharing with the others, I've known Ravi also a very long time. We've been classmates and friends since our first MBBS days.
Thank you, sis.
The third panelist, she's joining shortly. She's just come back from duty and wanted to change out, is my sister, also a serving Lieutenant General in the Army. She was working with General Venkatesh. In fact, he was her boss, if I remember right. Right now, she is the Deputy Chief Integrated Defense Staff Medical. She's also on the board of governors of the Medical Council. She has been a past dean of the armed forces. And we do have one of the speakers who was a past student of Armed Forces Medical College and one who's still a present student. So it's going to be an interesting session for sure. Thank you very much, Madhuri, for joining us. She has been a part of our roadmap series right from the beginning and a very enthusiastic participant, well loved by the audience. Going on to the reason we are here today, like I said, this is D. And there are many negative things about the word D that sometimes we have to face. Of course, as doctors, we always face disease and death in our patients and in the workplace. But sometimes these affect our own health or loved ones, family members' health, or our colleagues' health. It also affects the way we can function. And it gives us roadblocks or setbacks at times. But what we are going to see from hearing the stories of the journeys of these wonderful speakers is how they overcame such challenges and continue to bravely battle it. And really, I mean, I have great gratitude that I have personally known every one of these speakers and panelists. And I've been very blessed in my life to have such wonderful people in my life. So thank you all the speakers for being with us today. And without much ado, let's start with the first speaker, Pooja.
Just to announce here, Madhuri has joined and she's been here. Can you hear me, guys?
Welcome, Dr. Madhuri.
Yeah, thank you. I've been here since 6 p.m. trying to desperately ping all of you all that, I was like not seen and on the panel, but I would like to say it's an honor to be back with you all. Thank you so much and good evening, General Venkateswar, all friends and Anjali. It's a real pleasure and I hand over. Thank you so much.
Okay, here we have Dr. Pooja Ramnani.
Thank you. Good evening, everybody. At the outset, I would like to congratulate Dr. Nilima for starting such a good initiative, Doctors for Doctors. And I would also like to thank her for giving me the opportunity to be a part of such a wonderful initiative and to be a part of this webinar and share my story. My name is Dr. Pooja Ramnani, and I'm here to share my story of overcoming and dealing with diagnosis of multiple sclerosis through my medical college and after. So going back to 2010, when I was in my second year of medical school, I woke up one day with a rather numb feeling in my left abdomen and thinking that it's probably just a nerve pinch or something that I must have done to my back. I let it go for maybe a week or two and it was numb. And then it spread all over my body, which is when I decided I think I should tell my parents that, there's something off about me feeling numb and what is this? So then my father decided to take me to a neurologist and we went to a neurologist and then there were a series of MRIs that went. I was only in second year, I was 20, so I was very scared. But then the MRI showed some demyelination in the nerves, but they said it's probably post-viral and it's transverse myelitis, nothing to worry about. So I mean, being a medical student, not too much time to think about how, what, when, how. I let it go. I was like, okay, it's probably transverse myelitis. It'll get over. Moving on to third year, in my final exam of my third year is when I had my next major attack, which was blurring of vision in my left eye, following by weakness of my right limb, following by weakness of my right hand, which was over a span of about 6 months. This was just when I was entering my final year of med school. That's when I was like, okay, I guess it's time to repeat all the tests and get back to a diagnosis because this doesn't seem right where it can't just be transverse myelitis. Again, the series of tests, the MRIs, blood tests, neurologist visit. I was brought to Bombay to a very famous neurologist in Bombay. And on September 2012, I was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis. This was in my final year, just as I entered my final year. And for a 22-year-old who's just about to step into the real world after finishing such a difficult course, I guess it was too much for me to process. It was just like, what have I done? a lot of thoughts in my head as to what did I do wrong. I have always been very particular about what I'm doing, what I'm eating. I'm not like, everything. It was too much to process initially. But I have to give it to my doctor, my parents, my siblings, my friends. They were tremendous support from all of them. As soon as I was diagnosed, there was a lot of, since stress is the biggest contributing factor for an MS attack, everybody was advising me, like, I think you should quit, you should give up, you should not take this forward, because stress is such a big factor, you will deteriorate. And I was like, no, I cannot leave what I have started unfinished. So I guess it was the determination that took over in my final year, that I have studied so hard for 3 years, and then coming to the last bit, I can't give up. So again, I have to give it to my parents for supporting me throughout and being like, no, go ahead and do what you need to do. Starting on interferon injections in 2013, I went ahead, gave my final exams, and then followed by my internship, which I did successfully by the end of 2014. That was when I decided that I think it's time to take a sabbatical for a year, give myself some time to heal, process what has happened in the last 2 years that I didn't actually have time, because it was so cut to cut with final year exams, medication, diagnosis. There was a lot going on. And for a 22, 23-year-old, I think it was too much going on in 1 year. So I did take a sabbatical. I did give myself a break for, like, I thought my body needed to heal mentally, physically, emotionally. We needed that time. I needed to get back my self-confidence more than anything. I feel that diagnosis did bring me down, that, okay, maybe I might not be able to do what I want to, but it took me a year to get back onto my feet. Once I figured that, okay, this is, I am self-confident now, and I think I should move on, is when I decided to do Ophthal, and I got into a post-graduation in Bombay. I'd joined in 2016 because I was like, I can't let it go. I have worked so hard for 5.5 years of medicine, and then just letting it all go didn't make sense to me, and a diagnosis could not take that away from me. It's like, I wanted this all my life, so a diagnosis could not take it away. So when I joined to Ophthal in 2016, I thought, I had achieved it. I have come to a point where I have overcome a lot of my diagnosis, the fear and all of that. Until when I reached post-graduation, the environment I worked in was very, very challenging. I was looked down upon for having a condition. I was treated very differently. I was not considered at par with my colleagues. I was told things that were probably like really not the nicest to hear for someone who's trying to fight every day. But at all given times, I was reminded that I had a condition and I was probably not deserving of being where I was. Again, it did bog me down. It did bring me down for a bit. Then my parents came, my friends came, my brother came. They were like, no, this is what you wanted to do, and this is what you are going to do, irrespective of what people say. That's when I decided that discipline, determination is all I need to work really hard and make these people see that MS is just a part of me and MS is not me. Like, it doesn't define who I am. It's definitely a part of me that I can't get rid of anymore. I am on medication, but I decided that I will work so hard that people see beyond multiple sclerosis in Dr. Pooja Ramnani. So that was my motive in my ophthalmology 3 years. And I'm so proud and so happy to say that all the hard work did pay off, because coming to the second year of my residency, everybody at work started seeing that I was more than multiple sclerosis. I was a person who was very determined to do something in life, irrespective of the situations and the circumstances. And I was appreciated for all my hard work coming to my final year. And yeah, here I am, finished with my post-graduation, an ophthalmologist. And now I'm again on a sabbatical, considering the COVID situation. I'm taking a break. But yeah, that's my story in a nutshell of how I got through multiple sclerosis and became a doctor and went on to becoming an ophthalmologist.
Pretty amazing, Pooja. It's really awesome. I had a couple of questions, and then I'll ask Dr. Ravi also to ask you anything he feels like. During this journey, it has been a challenging journey for sure. Did you reach out and seek professional help from a psychiatrist or a psychologist or a counselor to help you get through those dark periods?
To be honest, Dr. Nilima, initially when I was diagnosed with it, I did not reach out because I had tremendous support in my mom and my dad. My mother was the pillar of my strength, where she just carried me through it all. Like, you know, at any time that I felt I was low, she used to keep reinstating the fact that, okay, no, you are as normal as you were before this. It's just a diagnosis. So initially, I overcame it very well. My brother, my father, my friends have been a tremendous support when it came to all of this. But I have to say that after my post-graduation, I mean, when I went through my post-graduation, it did drain me out emotionally. It did, because constantly I was reminded that I was not good enough. I was not good enough, not because I wasn't working hard enough. I was not good enough because I had a diagnosis that was attached to my name. So that, even though I overcame that and I fought it and I changed it, but I think by the end of it, I was emotionally drained out. So yes, that's when I did seek professional help, because I did get into anxiety, because I came to that point where I felt like I needed to prove myself at every given step. So that's when I did reach out to a psychiatrist to help me channel my thoughts and be like, okay, no, you know, you don't need to prove yourself at every step in life. It's not
Thank you for sharing that, because in Doctors for Doctors, one of the key things we are trying to get across the point is that doctors are also human beings. Like anybody else, we are as vulnerable, and it's perfectly okay to reach out and take help from any specialist.
Yes,
mental health or physical health.
Yes, I believe.
Thank you so much. Dr. Ravi, would you like to interact with our wonderful speaker before
Pooja,
we move on to the next person?
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you, Pooja. First of all, congratulations.
Thank you.
And you are an epitome of mental determination.
Thank you so
much. When I heard your journey, it will act as a leading example for not only to our doctor colleagues, but all the patients also. I just wanted to ask that why your colleagues were, and it is very disheartening to hear from you that your colleagues were looking down upon you during your post-graduation. Why was it so?
I think for one, in our country, or I would say I guess one, awareness about multiple sclerosis is not there. Like, people don't know so much about multiple sclerosis. It's still looked down upon to have a chronic condition in our country. And there's not much information that people with multiple sclerosis can also lead normal lives. It's just like any other chronic condition, like juvenile diabetes or like blood pressure or anything, that people lead normal lives. So I could never figure why they had a problem with it, because I never used it as an excuse to get out of work, which is why I was so proud of the fact that I had it, but I was still doing everything that my colleagues were doing. But they somehow thought that, you know, if she's going to stress, she's going to fail in life, and she's going to not have the best life if she's going to continue working and stressing. And I guess it's just lack of information and lack of awareness about multiple sclerosis in our country, which I feel needs to be worked upon, which is why I'm so open and so ready to talk about such a condition, because I feel that people need to know more about multiple sclerosis in our country. It is something that is lagging behind somewhere.
Yeah, but Pooja, the people you're talking are themselves doctors themselves. They are medical professionals.
Yes, so, but they
very, very sad. And privately, I would like to interact with you that which was this institution on a private mode, that why such people need to be talked to, that they need counseling. Rather,
I think one more point we can add to our Doctors for Doctors agenda is to create awareness and inclusiveness among medical colleges and postgraduate institutions. And we have two very eminent educationists and senior people who have been deans and now are in positions of implementing change. And I'm sure they'll take this message. Thank you.
Yes, thank
Before
you.
we go on to our next speaker, I would like to do an audience poll because we do have a fairly good number in the audience. So can we launch our first poll, please? I would request all the people to quickly answer all the three questions in the first 2 or 3, whatever number of questions are there, and answer honestly, because these are anonymous poll counting votes, and we just want to know what the feeling is among the participants. I'm not sure whether our panelists and our student speakers can also vote, but if they can, please go ahead. And while the polling is happening, I would like to take this opportunity to share that I had an amazing role model growing up, and my sister Madhuri and I both looked up to her, and that was my grandmother. She was an amazing woman, and actually I've written a book about her called My Aji and I. And she was the epitome of determination, dedication, and discipline, because she was born in 1896, when women did not really aspire for higher education in India. And coming from a very poor family in the rural part of Maharashtra, she was unfortunate enough to have lost her parent at age 2. So she was orphaned. And then at age 9, she was married as per the tradition. But at age 10, she became a child widow. And those two were two global pandemic or epidemic situations of plague and cholera that took her father and her young husband. And at that age of 10, she determined to pursue some education, become self-sufficient, and she went on to become a doctor from the BJ Medical College. And we have 4 people here who are from that college, and they will appreciate the fact that in 1928, when there were only 18 girls throughout the college, my grandmother was one of them. And she was an amazing human being. And today I'm getting to meet some more amazing human beings, equally determined, equally dedicated, and equally disciplined. Thank you very much. So let's close the poll and see the results. Okay. It says, I feel most stressed out due to 42% saying uncertainties in my life. Yes, it's true. These days, I mean, uncertainty is always a part of life, but I think these days, because of the pandemic, there's so much more uncertainty around the education system, the exams, and the future of all their careers. I understand. But there is a good 33% which are saying health issues in the family have caused stress. There are many families here who have, or extended families who have had either COVID or other serious health issues during this period, and it's definitely caused stress. So I agree, it's not an easy time, but I think with all the inspiration we'll get from our speakers today, people will learn how to handle this stress and cope with it. And the most used method for de-stressing and chilling out, it says music, sports or other hobbies, 75%. Wonderful, guys. I'm so happy. These are very healthy ways of combating stress. And social media browsing comes second with only 25%. I'm not sure if it's completely honest, but 0% use alcohol or tobacco. Kudos to all of you if you all are really being honest. And we have the commonest distractions in life. Okay, screen time. 33% says video, internet, Netflix, etc. 42% say complicated and tangled relationships. Wow, I can understand that relationships get more complex, especially if you're in different parts of the world. Excuse me. And
I think I'll use this time to chop in a little this thing and say that, you know, see, like we always talk of this uncertainty in life. I think, guys, you are all from the medical field. There's one certainty: you're going to be a doctor. I mean, look at this thing that you are going to have a medical profession, and come what may, at the end of it, that degree is yours for life. Nothing else is for life. But a degree of, once you finish, whether it's your MBBS, your MD, it's with you for life. So that's there's no uncertainty in that. And the second stress they said is people, you know, illness in the family and all. Again, look at the positive, that you are so lucky and empowered than the billions and trillions of people in the world who are not doctors. So you understand and you can do something about it. You and today, where most people are so worried when they go to a doctor, they don't even understand what the doctor is saying. You're way above ahead of that. You know what's happening to yourself, you know what's happening to your family. You can help and try to get the best. So I think that there's a positive in that, right?
Absolutely, absolutely. Thank you, Madhuri. And let's go on to our speaker number 2, Dr. Nishant.
Yes, thank you so much. Can I start?
Yes, please.
Yeah, so hello, I'm Nishant. Actually, I'm really honored to be, good evening everyone, I'm really honored to be given this opportunity. Although I don't like the circumstances that have brought me here, I'm going to speak about losing a close friend to suicide, feeling as I look back and coping up with the loss. So this happened, basically, it was on the 1st of October 2020. I get this news that my best friend, my roommate for 4 years during MBBS, Dr. Bhagwat Devangan, has committed suicide. It was a deep shock. I was not able to process anything after for 1 hour or so. But later on, when I just thought that it might not be a correct news, so I called a few friends. None of them had no knowledge of this. Then I called another close friend who resided in the same town as this friend, Dr. Bhagwat, was studying in, and he unfortunately confirmed that this is true, that this has happened, and that Bhagwat is no more. So I mean, it was hard to process. I mean, my response, I was first in deep state of shock. I remember I was at a dentist's appointment, and I came home. I called my father, and I just called my father to pick me up because I didn't even have the strength to walk back. I called my father. He came. He picked me up from the dentist's office, and I went home. I couldn't sleep the whole night. I cried for a long time. Then it was followed by a state of denial. I was like, this can't be true. He was such a strong person. Like, he would never ever take this path. I mean, if there's one person that I'm sure that he will not take this path, it will be Dr. Bhagwat. Then there was this, followed by this, it was this stage of anger. I felt angry upon myself because I knew that Bhagwat was going through some difficult times. I had also tried reaching him, but he did not pick up my call. I felt like I should have tried hard. I felt like I could have done more. But again, it was followed by a state of grief that lasted for about 15-20 days. Again, I was not able to do anything that was supposed to be done. And I was in the midst of applying to my application to the United States for doing internal medicine, post-graduation there. So I tried hard to channel my thoughts in the right way. And my following slide will tell how I did it. But that was followed by a state of acceptance that, all right, this has happened, but there's only one way to look, that is to forward. Then my feelings as I look back is, it was avoidable. I felt it was avoidable. We could have done more as a group. I mean, many friends we have so many good friends. There are so many good people around the world. We could have done more. And I feel suicide is probably the most painful cause of death. Don't get me wrong, all of them are terribly painful. Losing a loved one, I mean, I have gone through that previously. I was in second year. I lost my dear uncle, and it's always a painful experience, but this is probably the most painful of all. It also seems to me as the most easily preventable cause of death. Most of the times, you just need to talk. That's my idea. Many of us go through very, very difficult times, and if we just talk about it, we feel our heart feels light. We can cry it out. I mean, crying is not a sign of weakness. I definitely don't believe that. Crying is a sign that you have been strong for too long. Then how have I coped up to this? It was very hard to cope up. Number one thing that we should remember is you can't deal with the grief by denying it. It is, you have to accept that this has happened and I have to deal with it. You can't keep denying that I'm not sad. I mean, if you lose somebody who is really close to you, of course you are going to be sad. Then how I coped up of the D's that were described, I think devotion, determination, and discipline were the key aspects. Devotion, I think how I like to look at it is anything that you worship. Like for me, it is doing scientific writing. For many others, it could be going to temple. For many others, it could be playing badminton. For some others, it could be anything like going for a short walk. Determination that I have to move on. I have to move on, and I have to what has happened. I have to leave it behind. And discipline, I have to do it consistently and day by day, taking small baby step. I think we can achieve it. Then what have I learned from this terribly sad experience? I had the misfortune of going through this, but what have I learned from this? We should keep checking on our close ones. Of course, I mean, no matter, even if they're irritated by your phone call, or even if they don't feel the necessity of being called, even if they don't feel the necessity of you checking on them, I think you should definitely keep checking on your close ones, because there's no better thing than talk therapy. That's my motto. I have also been through some really difficult times during my final year, and I would say that was only I could only overcome them after I talked to my friends and family about it. Then again, my next point is on the similar line. We can overcome pretty much everything to a good extent with the right tool and guidance. I think most of the times, many of us deal with emotional issues. I think most of them can be, to a good extent, can be dealt with by talking to right people and using the right tool. Number 3, suicide is never an option. You must think about what others, like what your family will go through. We can't imagine the pain of a 55-year-old father who has raised you, and who has raised you to be a doctor, who has raised you to be an engineer, whatever, who have raised you till 25 years, and we can't imagine him. I mean, I can definitely not imagine him looking at your body. Relationships and family are more important than studies, career, or anything I can imagine. Of course, career is very important. This friend, Dr. Bhagwat, was doing MS orthopedics at one of the reputed colleges. But I mean, what did it lead to? I mean, I couldn't think of, I mean, I would rather have someone with me, and even if he's just doing well, that's it. That's enough for me. If you have any mental health issue or any other stress, please talk to anyone who is ready to listen. If you feel like there's no one in this world who will listen to you, please feel to reach out to me. Please feel to reach out to Nishant Tiwari. I will always be there. This stands even if I have never known you and we have never met. Then what are we doing?
Dr. Nishant.
I'm sorry.
I feel so sorry for your loss, and I can feel your pain even when you're talking about it. It must have been such a terrible time for you. But I'm so happy you shared it, because one of the important reasons for starting D4D, and Dr. Ravi will corroborate this, was to see how we can prevent unnecessary loss of life, which is on the rise. The number of suicides, the number of people going into depression is much higher today. And one of the ways is to create awareness and open up these channels where people can talk. So Dr. Ravi, you want to say something more about it from our D4D side?
Absolutely, you are absolutely right, Nilima, that this entire initiative which we started was with the main intention of helping out our medical students, young medicos, and even established doctors from not only preventing burnouts, but taking the extreme steps. Because then during that period, I recollect that we had a series of unfortunate incidences where our young doctors committed suicide. And we strongly felt that awareness, sensitization, and destigmatization of depression and burnout would be a great help in preventing. Even if we can save one life every year, I think all the efforts are worth it. Keep up the good work, sister. You're doing excellent, you and your team.
Thank you.
Can I intervene, Nilima, just for a minute?
Please.
Yeah. I think, Dr. Nishant, we empathize with you, and we applaud your bravery and your commitment towards this cause. And as somebody who has headed large institutions and now heading perhaps one of the largest private universities in the country, I think there's a lot of responsibility on us as medical administrators and educationists to look at this as a serious problem. And students, especially students who are staying in the hostels, are very vulnerable to many things. It's very essential that the faculty and the students group, in fact, we need to create a formal way of interacting regularly with them, formal way of connecting with them. We need to encourage, we need to have volunteer groups from within the students, from within the faculty, who keep on checking on them. And also as administrator, we need to create an environment that the students should feel free to connect with a certain number if she's depressed or if he's unwell, or contemplating issues like this. As Dr. Ravi said, it may not be possible for us to prevent everybody committing such a act, but definitely a significant number can be prevented. I think Madhuri will bear with me. Even as deans, it was so essential that we walked through the campus every evening. We walked the hostel, we went there, we spoke to people, and that gave an immense confidence to our students to reach out to us. In fact, we even, we were all, our numbers were with the students every time. Anybody could call anybody. Therefore, it's necessary for us to get down from our high seats in the institution and be with the student. And it's a moral duty to be present for the students at all times, and also create an environment in such a way that the students reach out for help rather than, in a sense of helplessness, they take their lives away. This is something that's very essential. Not only informal systems must be put in place, but formal systems that people checking on. I'm impressed with what Dr. Nishant said, that there has to be a system, there have to be people who take interest in the welfare, and they should be visiting hostels, visiting classrooms, and meeting with them and give them a sense of, feeling that if there is a problem, I could contact and freely talk to them. The other things that we have started, and it is working well, is to have student support centers with counselors. With anonymously, students can go and meet them and meet the counselor. It's difficult for the students to, if you say that go to the psychiatrist, most people will not go. It has to be out of the hospital. It has to be out in a place where it is easily accessible and anonymity could be maintained. I'm sure Dr. Madhuri will support me in what I've been saying all this time. Thank you very much.
Absolutely.
Just a quick question to the people who can probably make policies, etc. Just like annual health checkups, annual dental checkups are done routinely and people accept them as a preventive care, maybe annual mental health evaluation also should be part of our undergraduate, postgraduate training.
I would respond to that. It's right that you do that. When the people go to the doctors or talk to them, this is the time. Perhaps on a piece of paper as a part of recording, we may not be able to do it. It becomes a little problem. Most people would not open up when they first time go for an annual medical checkup. So much of it has to be done in an informal way. Yes. And it is happening. And the only way to prevent many such events occurring is to stay connected with the student, and also make some of the focused faculty to stay connected with the students. This is something very important.
Thank you so much. And let's quickly launch the second poll because it's linked to this topic that we have discussed. Can we just have the second poll launch? Once again, request everyone to quickly use the fastest finger first, like KBC, and give us the inputs. I think those who are on YouTube can't vote, right? Only those who are in the Zoom call can vote for us. Okay. As soon as at least 80% have voted, we will end the poll and see the results. If suicide is a preventable cause of death, if we identify the early warning symptoms and signs ourselves or among our friends and colleagues, and have access to reach out and get the timely assistance, support, counseling, or even treatment, because there are so many various causes that can lead up to that final moment. And D4D has done baby steps in that direction. This seminar itself should help create more awareness. The two questions I have asked here is about whether a person has experienced the pain of a life lost to suicide or accident, because those are sudden losses, unlike a long illness or a serious illness where you have time to prepare for that final outcome. A sudden loss of life, and that to a young life, hits harder. Not that others don't, but this seems to hit harder. Okay, let's stop and share the results. 29% says a friend or a person in a friend's family, they have experienced the pain of losing to suicide. So almost 30%, that's quite high. And 21% say a member of the extended family. So everyone seems to know someone who has ended his life. And I'm sure the state of their families after that is really hard to watch. And when I learned the death of by suicide of a person I knew, what did I feel? And here it says 43% mainly pain and sadness. And nobody felt shock or anger, but that was one emotion expressed by Nishant. And some of them have said all of the above. So pain, sadness, fear, guilt, anger, shock, everything. And some have said they didn't feel any of these emotions. Probably they were just too numb to feel it. Thank you for your polling. Quickly moving on to the next speaker, we have Dr. Anjali. She is going to talk about a different challenge that she has faced in her career. Over to you, Anjali.
Good evening, everyone. I was extremely distressed to see Nishant's and Pooja's stories. They have brought it out so well. This seems rather mundane compared to the challenges they have faced with such determination. I will be speaking to you.
But it's a common problem. So I think we have to see it all the perspectives. Yes.
I will be speaking to you about my experiences of the challenges of adapting from the role of a clinician to an administrator. I will speak about three aspects: administration, union, and personnel management. Incidentally, I was the additional director of Central Government Health Scheme, so I'm speaking from that perspective. Next slide. In the medical college, during post-graduation and residency, the focus is on learning from textbooks and learning practicals from clinics on how to practice medicine, not on administration and infrastructure of healthcare. A doctor is accountable for any patient care situation, but in fact, it takes a team, nurses, pharmacists, orderlies, cleaning staff, and others. I was selected through the UPSC and joined the central government health scheme in Chennai. On the very first day, I had a patient in the OPD with pneumonia, and he had an X-ray confirming it. In the early 80s, limited antibiotics were available in the outpatient. As he was allergic to injection procaine penicillin, which was readily available, I prescribed capsule tetracycline, 50 milligrams, 4 times a day for 5 days. When the patient went to the pharmacy to collect it, the pharmacist was aghast. They had only 100 capsules stock for the entire dispensary to last for 6 months. Then a senior advised me to reduce the dose to 2 per day and only if it was absolutely necessary. With my training in pediatrics, I was accustomed to dose calculation in milligrams per kilogram body weight automatically. So this was unacceptable, and I preferred to give the full dose of sulfonamides, which were then freely available. It is from this early experience that I learned that prescriptions are not made in a vacuum. That lesson stayed with me. When I took charge of CGHS Bangalore as head of administration, I ensured that a provisioning committee was made where inputs of all levels of doctors were taken for current prescribing practices, because prescriptions change in several years. A consolidated procurement process was done for the organization. In these COVID times, innovation occurred because of inputs from frontline doctors. When full PPE is not required, the use of transparent plastic screen between the doctor and the patient in the OPD, placing a fan behind the doctor to direct airflow away to avoid droplet infection, then outdoor consultations whenever possible. Because of good communication between doctors and administration, it is possible to implement these methods of safety. That is why it is important for a doctor to head any medical organization, because there is a direct link between the clinician and the administration. And because of this link, policy decisions like online appointments, teleconsultations have been implemented in COVID times. In normal times, a personal visit is always preferred. The third aspect of my experience in administration as additional director in CGHS was with regard to computerization. It was fortunate during my tenure, it got a major boost. I used every opportunity I could find to implement it in all areas of work in CGHS Bangalore. Computerization was new and it posed challenges to us every day, but I was determined to implement it fast. Prescriptions were already computerized, but not processed in administration. After computerization, doctors and staff were able to access online their personal information about finances and salary and annual performance reviews. Budget allocation, distribution, medicine and equipment procurement, everything became transparent and had fewer roadblocks in the administrative process. CGHS Bangalore was held up in esteem among all other cities. The key takeaway here is that every doctor, in addition to the practice of clinical medicine, needs to be an active learner of what goes into health administration. The second part I will talk about in administration is dealing with the union. Every large organization has a union to represent the welfare and interests of employees. A union is like the opposition in political parties, opposes every action taken by the incumbent. Though policy is made by heads of institutions, the execution is by clerks who take advantage of the lack of knowledge of doctors in administration. On one occasion, it had come to my notice that pharmacists who were union functionaries were invariably in charge of medical stores in the offices and the dispensaries where drug flow was controlled. The other pharmacists, seniors also, had to work under such individuals. They felt demotivated. So I posted all the pharmacists according to seniority to head the stores. Now, transfer of any category is often a point of dissent, and particularly so of union members. One day, without intimation, some 40 or so union members barged into my office and occupied all the chairs and standing room to intimidate me. In raised voices, they demanded withdrawal of orders as it upset their apple cart. They then threatened to go on strike. I did not get perturbed much because I had done the homework. I listened patiently without interrupting to everyone who wanted to speak, and I maintained an eye contact with the speaker. At the end of the confrontation, without raising my voice, I explained the reasoning behind the decision was to ensure fair distribution of posts, and it was legal. The situation was diffused when they realized that I was determined to implement it, and they all left and did not go on strike. It set the tone for the rest of my administrative tenure. It is a duty of administration to maintain a good working relationship with the union and to find a balance between cooperation and coercion so that patient care is maintained, maximized, and you're fair to the personnel. The third aspect of my journey from clinician to administrator is personnel management. A lot of problems can be avoided by good communication with colleagues and staff to make them feel valued. Help individuals grow, praise and spread cheer. All doctors, especially junior doctors, are more exposed to recent advances. They were encouraged to take decisions and coordinate in treating of complex cases of malignancy. Nurses were asked to demonstrate use of inhalers and insulin to patients. Pharmacists were enlisted to give talks on pharmacovigilance. Acknowledging good decisions in complex cases of doctors and recognizing proactive work by nurses, pharmacists, and clerks, and reminding clinic staff of their value as an important cog in the machinery.
Sorry, I think Nilima is asking to be unmuted. I think she's got muted.
Ways to motivate your staff. Thank you.
Anjali, can you hear me? Sorry to interrupt. Requesting you to cut short the presentation so that we can move on. The important point has been understood, I think, that though we are clinicians, patient care and healthcare is a team effort and people skills become very important. So could you please just cut short your presentation?
See, you're done. I've completed it.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much. A big applause. Why this was important is that young doctors also will have to go ahead and take on administrative roles. And
exactly.
Transitioning from clinical to non-clinical can be mentally challenging also. Thank you very much, Anjali, for being with us.
Thank you.
Quickly move on to our next speaker, Gabriela Sharon. Over to you, dear.
Dr. Nilima, can I just have a minute?
No, I think, yeah, let us start off.
Youngest speaker, and over to you, Sharon.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for this opportunity. I'd like to share my story with you, and I hope that some of you would get inspired by it. So, last year, 2019, after I finished writing my NEET exam, I prepared for it over a year. And in July, I had to go for my counseling. So initially there was government counseling where I had to be allotted government seats according to my score, my NEET score. And on 11th July, I was appointed a private seat in the government medical college in Madurai. And so that was the first preference, obviously. So we had to travel all the way to Madurai to submit my original certificates. And few days later, just 3 days after that, we had CMC counseling, CMC Vellore counseling. And since my parents are both staff at CMC, I fell under the staff quota, and staff quota had 10 seats. And out of the 10 seats, I'd come fifth. So my preference was CMC over this government college. So I had to go back to Madurai and retrieve all of my original certificates on 15th. So on 15th morning, after we collected all my certificates and we were returning home back to Vellore, that's when I met with a terrible accident. The driver just swerved off the road and our car crashed 3 times. And yeah, it was, I have some pictures. Yeah, the car was really wrecked. My parents and the driver were fine, but I was stuck in the car. I actually didn't know what happened in the beginning because I think I was in a shock or in a daze. I don't know what it was, but they dragged me out of the car soon. And only when they told me to try to get up, that's when I realized that I had lost all my sensation below my neck. I couldn't feel anything. I couldn't lift my arms or move my arms. And I was in extreme pain. My neck was paining a lot. And I couldn't breathe properly. Later, I found out that I had broken my neck. There was a burst fracture in one of my cervical spine. And my spine was also severely compressed. And one of my lungs had collapsed. So that's why my breathing was really hard. So I have some pictures. This was just a day before the accident, after getting the CMC seat. And this was the car. I had to show these pictures because it's only God's grace that all of us are alive and well, because this accident looks like a really major one. And this was just before entering the operation theater. Yeah, and that was my X-ray. Basically, we had to undergo an emergency surgery to stabilize my spine. And the operation lasted for like 8 hours. But they inserted rods and plates and they stabilized it all right. After that, I was admitted in the neuro ICU for 2 weeks, 15 days actually. And that was, now I tried like to bring in my first D, that is devotion. In the beginning of the ICU experience, it was all right because I was being fed by the nurses and there was a lot of attention and all. But towards the end, they had to fix an NG tube to me and I couldn't taste food for the next 2 weeks. And slowly the isolation started getting to me, and my isolation, especially in the ICUs and when you're not allowed visitors, it can have a really bad or unhealthy effect on your mind because most probably you'll see that people experience hallucinations and it's just a warped mind. You start imagining things and it gets really scary. So there are 2 things that I tried to avoid getting deeper into this isolation was whenever my parents would visit me, that was only twice a day, I would always keep asking them what was happening outside. I keep asking them what the doctors are saying, what's happening at home, what's up in the medical seat, is it all right? My dad had paid the fees before time, just minutes before the deadline, so my seat was safe. And it's so important to keep in touch with time. There was no windows next to me, so I only had a clock, but still it was really hard to keep in touch. And the main thing that helped me cope, because most of the time I was alone, was personal devotion. I had my phone with me all the time, so I used to read my Bible on my phone. I used to listen to music on the phone, and that really helped me overcome this. The only problem would arise when my phone would die. I couldn't help that. So these are some pictures of the ICU. This is my sister. And that was some of the exercises, the lung breathing exercise I had to do. That is the maximum I could blow the balloon. And then I was shifted to CMC. After 15 days, I was shifted to CMC and everything seemed fine. Actually, they were even willing to shift me to the ward. They took out my NG tube and I was able to eat food normally. But I think I got too excited and I aspirated some of my food and I couldn't cough it out because my lungs were not that strong enough and my oxygen saturation dropped all the way to 70s. So I had to be shifted to critical ICU again for 5 more days. And disappointing as it was, it actually helped me. It was then that I started doing a lot of things. My hand grip started improving. This is the first picture where I could hold the glass on my own and drink on my own, like my first independent act. This was when I was able to sit up for the first time after more than 3 weeks. I felt really giddy at this point. And there's something called a tilt table where they keep increasing the angle to make you more accustomed to upright posture. And this is my first day of therapy. It was really hard because it was all simple activity, but I couldn't do anything with my hands at the time. But now thank God, it's improved. So after this, when I was strong enough in the hospital, they shifted me to a rehabilitation center. And this center was extremely disciplined, and I wasn't expecting this level of discipline to be there. They had a rigid timetable from 8 a.m. till 4:30 p.m. with extreme exercises, with physiotherapy and occupational therapy, and everything was set according to the time. And we had weekends off, and they had a lot of extracurricular activities which helped to de-stress all of us. Every Friday we would have like art therapy where all of us are supposed to draw or paint or do something and engage our creativity. And my art kept getting better every week because I had to use crayons that are really hard to grip. And they expected us to practice everything daily. So I had to propel my wheelchair every day. This was an occupational therapy room. I was supposed to do sitting balance here. And this is in the PT gym. These are all wheelchair friendly exercise machines. This is a standing table where they prop you up for a fully upright this time for like an hour or so. And this is during rehab Mela. We had a like a fundraising thing, and we had to make stuff. So I was making paper bags, and the tying of the knots were counted as my occupational therapy. And this is me playing the piano for the first time in the chapel. It was really hard because my fingers were really weak at that time, but I had to practice a lot. And this is my sister and I playing Jenga. At this time, my fingers were fine and I didn't make the tower tumble. My fingers were pretty steady at this time. This is the whole staff that helped. Not everyone, this is only the physiotherapy department. At this point, 6 months are over in rehab and I had to leave. I learned a lot. Especially this is the third D now, determination. I learned a lot through the other patients around me. 6 months was a lot of time in rehab and I made so many friends, and most of them were brain injury patients, and compared to them, I was in a much better position. So it avoided me falling into self-pity, and instead I started being thankful for what I could do instead of what I couldn't. And I never forgot like what I was focused on. I worked for an entire year to get into medicine, and this setback, I didn't want it to let me forget what I was aiming to work for. These are my friends in rehab. This is just before leaving rehab. I had a lot of saying goodbye to. This is my mom and me in the chapel. The chapel was a really pretty place. And this is my parents, and we were just getting ready to leave. After leaving, I went back home and I started doing all my normal activities. I tried gardening. And this is during my dad's party. We had a whole birthday party at home. And this is me in a car. After rehab, they taught me how to do shifting from wheelchair to car. And after I learned that skill, we went around for a lot of rounds because I could actually get into a car now. So this one verse in the Bible was what helped me throughout. It wasn't just a normal verse because it was quite special to me, because it was found in my seat in the accident site, and I've never seen it before in my life. When my father went to collect all the things in the car, this was found in my seat, and this is what it said. So like every time during my darkest times, I would always remember, I believe that this was God's promise for me throughout to make me strong and to encourage me. So I use this as my encouragement throughout this entire year. that's it.
Wonderful, wonderful, Sharon.
Thank you.
Your journey has been so difficult and there are many challenges still, but your faith in yourself and God's grace is always going to be with you. We are your cheering squad, okay?
Thank you. Thank you, ma'am.
And I think the message here, apart from the fact that you have come so far and done so well, is that you wish to continue your study. And it is important that our colleges are made more specially able friendly for access of all these areas, as well as you should not be deterred from going on to do whatever specialization. And you're going to be an amazing, amazing doctor.
Thank you. Thank you,
God
ma'am.
bless you.
Thank you.
Can I take a minute, Nilima,
Yes,
on this?
please. Yes, please.
Sharon, wonderful, and it's refreshing to see you, and highly, you're a star, and
Thank
you're
you,
a beacon
sir.
of hope for a lots of people who get into such situations as you have been, and your level of motivation, your mental strength, and the positive mindset is something that is to be admired. I'm a
Thank you,
fan of
sir.
yours, and I think it is important for you to now write something about it and give it to the other people, to motivate them to stay strong, to believe in themselves, not to lose hope. And
Yes, sir.
also the two things that you made, all of us clinicians have seen some of our patients getting absolutely, kind of a disoriented in ICU setup.
Yeah.
That is because of the constant light, the mechanical sounds, a lack
Yeah.
of sleep, a movement, and other things. And what you brought out is something very, very important. That is to stay connected with time, space, and
Yeah.
connected with the environment. And more importantly, stay positive. And the point that you brought about devotion and believing in something good happening to you is something that is very, very important. And all of us in the fag end of our life realize that there's something more than human effort to make things happen the way it has happened. Wonderful child, and I'm sure you're going to be a big, big motivational
Thank
speaker
you.
as we go forward. And I'm sure you're going to help many people to come out of their difficult situations. God bless you. God bless you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir.
And I think all of us echo your sentiments, General Venkatesh. And we have Dr. Robert. He's a fellow pediatric surgeon like me, and we have a third pediatric surgeon, my good friend Dr. Daspit also. Interesting that there should be three of us, but maybe it's something to do with us that we are always determined and never say no, okay? So let's hear Robert's story, which is equally and amazingly challenging, but an amazingly wonderful narration. Over to you, Robert.
Good evening, everyone, students and colleagues. I'm really amazed at the sharing of Nishant today and Sharon, because I feel part of that journey somehow. And I'm really glad for Dr. Nilima to have organized this entire setup. I know we're running short of time, so I'm going to rush through what I have to say, but it's basically a story that I want to say. A story which many people didn't believe when I was going through the peak of it. To put it in a short, succinct thing, I had a fantastic professional career. I went through the best of colleges and institutions. I trained in Tata Memorial, trained in AIIMS Delhi, went and worked in University of Sydney. Nothing was going wrong. I have a beautiful family, a beautiful wife, 2 kids. I came back and I was teaching in St. John's, my alma mater, as an associate professor. Nothing could be further from bad news. And bang, out of the blue, the big bad D word, the depression word. I'm glad that Dr. Nilima chose D as the alphabet today, because I'm talking about depression. And the big black cloud called depression just arrived, and it arrived with no reason. And that is one of the problems why it took me almost 2 years of denial before I could even accept that I was depressed, because I had no reason. There was no major catastrophe in my life. There was nobody who died close to me, professionally, financially, family-wise. Everything was fine. And especially me, if for the ones who know me, I'm a very, very positive guy. I was a student counselor in St. John's at that time, motivating youth, and that was part of my DNA. And so the first question, which most of my friends asked me, is how can you feel depressed? And I could understand that, because when I was in Sydney, I once read an article in the British Medical Journal where an anesthetist had written his struggle with depression. And my first question was, how can you being a doctor be depressed? How can you even admit that you were depressed. Because I actually thought to myself, what will his colleagues think of him? Will he get jobs? When he goes for an interview, people would read this thing and say, "Arey, he's a depressed fellow." And so I actually, in my mind, had laughed at him. So when it came to me, I was equally strong in my denial, and I didn't tell people. And the few times, and this is I'm sharing as a word of advice for everyone who might come across somebody else who might be going through this. Most of my friends, in good faith, when I explained somewhat what I was feeling, and that I was feeling very low and feeling depressed, the commonest answer, very well-meaning, all of them are good people. They would say, "Come on, pull yourself up." And I would think like I'm a pair of socks which has rolled down. It's not as easy as pulling yourself up, or roll up your sleeves, or get on with it, and read positive help books. All that are the worst things that we can tell someone who is down and out. Because being down and out, being depressed is a very recognized condition. It is like diabetes. I have diabetes too. So I take my medication for diabetes. And it took me a long time to accept that even this is a chronic medical condition with its own therapy. So in those 2 years, when I realized that my operating was going down, and I wasn't able to teach, and I had stopped going 3 months, I didn't enter OT because I didn't trust myself with my operating skills. It looked like everything was falling apart. That is when the stepsister of depression came along, very pretty. She was addiction. And when addiction came in, it was a 1.5 years of chemical addiction which came in. That was a double combination of depression and addiction. And everybody was confused what to do. My kids were pre-teens. My wife was working. And professionally, I took leave. Everything looking dark. So I could understand what Nishant was talking about, his friend, the really dark days when suicide really comes so close and it feels almost natural. For us, when we are in our normal equilibrium, it feels so abnormal. But at some point in time, when the days get so dark, it almost seems logical. It seems, yeah, this is what I'm meant to do. This is what you have to go for. And I take no credit for coming out of that depression and the addiction, because there is no way that one person can fight this on their own. That is where the other D comes in for today. For me, that is, don't hesitate to take help. Don't hesitate to take help. And it's a great step of humility, of becoming humble, because for me, I was associate professor. I sought help. I went to NIMHANS, which is the big neuro center. I went in as a general patient and walked in, and my wife took me there. We put our card in, and a very young doctor, very brilliant guy. And at the end of the session, he looked after me for 8 months of counseling. At the end of the first session, he told me, "Dr. Robert, you taught me as an undergraduate." He was my student. Can you imagine? I didn't even recognize him in the state that I was. And coming back home, I was thinking, like, it can't be more humbling than this, that you have to grant to your own student. But it worked for me. It worked for me because I think in a way life was taking me through this for many, many reasons. So don't hesitate to take help, no matter who it is. And especially if you find people telling you pull up your socks or read a positive thinking book, don't go to them to talk. Go to a professional. It absolutely pays to go to a professional. And then slowly over a period of time, Dr. Pratima Murthy, who's part of our D4D group, and she worked hard as well, and this came out. But I want to actually share, because a practical take-home point for us, which I want to tell all young people and people at our mid-stage in life, is don't hesitate taking help from friends. Because for me, 2 guys stepped in, and I did not call for help. When you're so dark, when you're alone in your darkest period, you don't feel like taking help, and you don't even believe that somebody will come and give you help. You don't believe that. It's part of your depression, that you will think nobody likes me, no one's going to help me. But 2 boys, one was Ramesh, another pediatric surgeon, very dear friend, and one was Akash, who I didn't know much that time. He only saw me from a distance in church. These 2 guys would call me every day or come and meet me at least once a week. But the daily affirmation, the other D I want to stress here, what Sharon spoke about was daily devotion. So in a similar phase of devotion is affirmation. Your faith can be your affirmation. For me, it was my friends who were my affirmation. And they would just call for half a minute to 1 minute. And I make it a point now to try to do that for other people who I know who are going through a dark phase. So daily affirmations are very good. And always to believe that the darkest hour is when the help will come. You should just have the humility to take that help and not say, I'm this big guy, I don't need. What help am I talking about? I'm still on medication. My work has got back to proper full speed. I run a big surgical group. I run a full private surgical group in Bangalore. I have my other hobbies and habits which I keep to keep myself interested. Relationships I'm building now, valued relationships I'm building now, which are new relationships, which give you depth, which give you connection, especially outside our field. We doctors are a big mistake of making all our friends in the medical field or in the people who we work with. That is a disaster, because all of us go through bad situations at work. We need to know what the real world outside also looks. Yeah, and to also accept that this is a long battle. It's not something which is, okay, I went into it, I got out of it. It is exactly like diabetes. It is going to stay. It's a matter of fine tuning. It's a matter of determination and daily aware and being aware, being self-aware. Even there are days even now, and I know that I'm slipping, I'm going down into my depression again, but just to be aware of myself. But my last message is not just don't be aware just of yourself, especially if you're a medical student, if you're a teacher in a medical college, or if you're in a group practice, be aware of another colleague who is behaving a little differently from what you know. Recognize it and be there for that person. Maybe just gentle nudges. Don't go and give a positive thinking book. That's the worst thing to do. But go and just spend time, have a cup of tea, have a cup of coffee. At some point they'll open up. That is what my friends did for me. So daily affirmation, don't hesitate for help, and don't deny. Doctors have one of the highest rates of suicide, of addiction, and of depression. It's time we talk about it. Thank you.
Thank you, Robert. Don't be in denial. That's also a D. Quickly going on to our next young speaker, who has also been through a horrendous experience, but has come out very bravely. She has connectivity issues, so she uploaded a video she made of her talk. Maybe please launch it right now. Let's hear from Amlina about her very recent brush with near death and with death in the family.
A very good evening to all of you. So it all started with me waking up on the 12th of June in an ICU cabin with random tubes and dressings all over my body. My first reaction was to smile, because it felt great to finally be in a hospital. After months of a boring lockdown, I was finally where I belonged. But the only difference this time was, I wasn't the one who could help. In fact, I was the one who needed help this time. I wasn't the one who could pray for the recovery of my patients. But in fact, I was the one who needed prayers this time. I called in for a nurse, and she went on to tell me that me and my family had suffered a terrible road traffic accident on the 5th of June, and my sister too was admitted in the same ICU. I asked her about my parents, and she told me that my dad was fine. He didn't suffer any serious injury. Probably the seatbelt had saved him. But she had no clue about my mom. That's when I understood that maybe I'd lost her forever. That maybe the soul that I loved the most would never meet me again. Even before I could express how much I loved her, even before I could take care of her exactly the way she took care of me my entire life. That's when I understood that probably my life would never be the same again. When I was brought to the hospital, I was in a very bad condition. I had pneumothorax and severe lung contusions bilaterally, liver laceration, perihepatic blood collection, femur fracture on my right leg, and a foot drop on my left. Other than that, I had multiple hairline fractures on my hip bone and countless wounds all over my body. And 12th of June was the day when I had finally regained my orientation after almost a week in the ICU. And a lot had happened in those 7 days. An emergency damage control surgery to take care of my pneumothorax. I was put on a ventilator, I was taken off it. A surgery was done to deal with my femur fracture, and another one was being planned for my foot drop and sciatic nerve injury. But the real battle wasn't physical. It was all emotional. The pain and grief that came with losing my mom, the fear of never being able to walk normally again, the fear of being bedridden for long, and a lot more. Every night in the ICU, I would see my mom in my dreams and would wake up crying and shouting. This continued for a couple of days. But one day, there was this fine moment when I realized that now on, it's on me to take care of my father and my sister. It's on me to be 100% of the woman my mother raised me to be, and 0% of the sad, depressed, weak girl that I was. that very moment. And this one realization changed everything. After 2 weeks in the ICU, finally I was shifted to the ward. The same day, I had called up my best friend back in college, and in the middle of a conversation, I realized that I could move my toes. My foot drop had miraculously vanished. That's what love and blessings can do to you, even when you're thousands of miles apart. Initially, I could barely speak a few words without my oxygen cannula. I was on a heavy dose of narcotics, sleeping pills, and painkillers to make my existence a little pain free. But eventually, I decided to request my doctors to reduce them to minimum. The result? Well, my wounds and physiotherapy for my legs caused unbearable pain every night. I would cry out in pain and couldn't sleep night after night. Then I decided to do a stock taking and change things a bit. Instead of crying and wasting time, I decided to use that time to do breathing exercises and work on my muscles. This one little change in perspective worked wonders for me. Within a week, I could lift all the three balls up in the spirometer. And for me, that was a huge, huge achievement. Nobody expected me to achieve that feat so fast, me included. I was told that I would take months to walk normally without support. Well, that also meant months of staying in my bed, months of wearing diapers, and months of having a life that depended heavily on others for every little thing. And yeah, that did sound scary. That did sound depressing. For some reason, I felt like challenging my body to the limit, and I did. At that moment, pain was a privilege. The more I challenged myself, the more alive and empowered I felt. But if I were to walk, I had to start working on myself straight away. I looked at myself closely. My hands and legs were half the normal size. All my muscles were weak and flaccid. So I made up a plan to get my muscles back. I started taking protein shake 3 times a day. I started using my left leg to walk with the help of a walker. But using a walker required tremendous amount of arm strength. And my biceps and triceps at this point in time were good for nothing. So I asked my dad to get me a 2-liter Pepsi bottle and I started using it like a makeshift dumbbell. I would exercise my arms and do countless repetitions each day. And within a week, I had perfect biceps. I was using the walker like a pro. In my 5th week, finally, I was allowed to put my right foot down on ground. Yes, the one with the fracture. And the day they allowed me to stand up, I just stood up, did a perfect 50-50 weight bearing, and started grooving to the tunes of the song that was playing on the TV. My physiotherapist was appalled and exclaimed, "Take it easy, dear. We don't want a refracture. We'll dance for sure, but pehle chalna seekh lete hain." On the 3rd day of my physiotherapy, I told my physiotherapist that I wanted to walk without support. She asked me if I was sure, and I said yes, without a second thought. And lo and behold, I could walk. Of course, I was very tentative and I was limping, but what mattered to me is the fact that I decided to do something and was able to do it for real. After just 2 weeks of me and my family being told that I would take months to walk without support, I'm so privileged and over the top happy to tell you all that not just walking around, I was dancing to my favorite songs. I'm not much of a dancer. I never was. But I don't know. I just feel like celebrating life. Those 2 months in the hospital, they weren't the best of days, but they definitely were the most important. They taught me what nothing else could have, ever: gratitude and compassion. If nothing, this experience would definitely make me a better doctor. Tomorrow, when I see my patients, I'll treat them as people with families and not just as cases with a specific group of symptoms. The first time I met my surgeons, the people who saved my life, in fact, I never met them. I was unconscious, almost dead. Every day when they would come for rounds, I would visualize myself walking up to their cabins one day and thanking them with all the respect that they deserved in a condition that they would be happy to see me in. That was a dream, and I always wondered if I would ever be able to fulfill it. Looking back, the most important thing for me was the courage to make brave decisions. When everyone around me said that, you know what, you should take it slow, there was something in me that said, even if I push my limits a bit, nothing probably can go wrong. On my final day in the hospital, I walked up to my surgeons. Yes, I didn't take my walker along. Thank them for everything that they had done for me. Fulfilling this small little dream of mine was important. It gave me a sense of satisfaction, a sense of victory over my disability. I still
Wonderful. Wow, Sharon. And she says she has gratitude. I translate that as a great attitude. Way to go, Sharon, and all the very best, and God bless you.
That was Amlina.
Oh, sorry, Amlina. Sharon was before. I'm still
Yeah.
really zapped by these wonderful youngsters
Yeah, isn't
who are
it
so brave,
amazing?
so courageous.
And
Amlina, God bless you.
Amlina, I am
Thank you so much, ma'am.
proud of you. I've seen, just to share with you all, I've seen Amlina as a brilliant student in college. And I mean, even I didn't know this. I knew she was a determined girl doing extremely well, but this dancing to this thing, and just to share with you all, she's back in college today, joined back after this, and I'm so proud of you, Amlina. Well done, and God bless. Your determination is what did it. Keep it up.
Thank you so much, ma'am. Thank you so much.
And on to Dr. Prabjot. She's a gynecologist, IVF specialist, and she also is very determined to help her patients. I hope she's able to connect. She has some challenges. If not, we move on to Dr. Smith. प्रभजोत आप हो वहां? अनम्यूट करिए प्लीज. हाँ, very good.
Ma'am,
yeah, you're audible. Carry on.
Okay. First of all, I would like to thank Dr. Nilima Kadbi, ma'am. Ma'am, it's a great honor that you remembered us for this great program. I think it's a very inspirational program, and the series needs to be carried on for the interest of our junior and junior and senior doctors alike. Ma'am, मेरी story इतनी लंबी है कि मुझे I really don't know. I don't have a particularly a very sad experience in my life, but गागर में सागर भरते हुए मैं अपनी जिंदगी की कुछ स्टोरी को हाईलाइट करना चाहूंगी. Can you hear me, ma'am?
Yeah.
Yes, you're audible.
Okay.
I really want to hear about how you help your patients who are not able to conceive naturally and sometimes get very depressed when IVF fails. So how do you deal with that?
First 1.5 minutes I would like to give to my life, how I was as a little girl. I was born in a very normal middle class family. My father was actually he retired as a senior most engineer in the state of Haryana. And I was, by the grace of God, I think it's only by his grace that I was, a very good all-rounder, the best singer, theater artist and dancer and everything, everything. I would just be so excited about everything. A person who would always be interested in giving, taking part in declamation contests and everything. So life was all very exciting till we got to our 10th class, where we had to decide that what we wish to be in our life. And then a thought came to my mind that yes, we would like to be heroes in real life, and probably nothing better than doctors in my eyes. And by the grace of God, then we had got admission into Rohtak Medical College, 1984. And after finishing there, I went to Bombay to do my MD. And after doing my MD and doing my lecturership in almost 3 medical colleges in Bombay, 3 government medical colleges in Bombay, I left for England in 1996. Something I would like to share about my when I was a medical student, because I was and always very excited, girl and adolescent, a child as well as an adolescent. A change in my life came in 3rd year MBBS, when I had a fractured tibia and fibula, and it was I had a horrendous accident when I was in my 3rd year MBBS. I remember that almost for about 5-6 months, I was on a wheelchair, and I would, after 2 months of my accident, I had joined back my medical school, and I would attend all my classes and all my clinics in the 3rd year MBBS on the wheelchair. It was known as a royal wheelchair in my college. And after about, say, after 2 months of my fracture, I came to know that it was a case of malunion. You know, the alignment was not proper. So the head of the department, he actually broke all the callus, and he gave torsions to my legs and broke callus. And it was after 5-6 months of being on a wheelchair, I went on a crutches, you know. And after 8 to 9 months had passed now, and my bone would refuse to unite. And now they had started advising me to go for an operation for a bone grafting, and with no assurances for an assured outcome. You know, they wouldn't say that definitely, you know, you will have a positive outcome and you'll start running and walking. And for me, the biggest thing in life was, you know, I really used to look at people who were running and walking and were able to, you know, switch on and off put the fan off and on, especially during my earlier days of my fracture. You know, it had become a dream for me to run and walk and dance and do whatever I wanted to do. And this experience of mine is really surprising, because I never wanted to go for this operation of bone grafting. And I stayed in my own medical college's private ward for about 7 to 8 months, when my mother suddenly remembered, after about 9 months of my fracture, that we had a family tradition where, you know, there's a peculiar way of performing prayers where people in a group at 3 o'clock in the morning would do some vidhi purvak prayers. And then she said, this is my only hope, my mother told me. And I obviously agreed to her, because I was not very happy with the idea of undergoing an operation. And that was and it is a very surprising share with all of you, that I came back from after performing those vidhi purvak prayers that we call in Hindi. And you know, 3 months after that incident, my fracture, my bone, which had refused to unite, callus started forming, and within 3.5 months, my fracture had united and had left my crutches.
So it was a life-changing experience for you, the power of prayer.
It made me look inwards, and it made me I was already a spiritual child, I think, since my childhood, but it changed me completely from a girl who was always, you know, interested in dancing and doing all the outward activities and very excited in all those activities. And suddenly I found myself, it brought a very big change in my life. And these type of
one message from this, because we would run out of time. Where can you give a message on this about?
Madam, actually, in short, I want to give the message that जिंदगी में वो जो change उस वक्त start हुआ, that inspired me कि you know, to become a holistic doctor whenever whichever way, जिस भी जिंदगी के stage पे पहुंचे हम लोग एक अच्छे doctor बनने की quest में. So ma'am, I went to England for 4 years. मैंने जिंदगी में बहुत दुख दर्द देखे, मतलब इतना depression, इतना दुख. Colon cancer is very common, young cancers are so common, all kind of PIDs and depressions are very common in that society. और मैं इंडिया वापस आई, so this was a very big blessing for me coming back to India. Of course, I joined Christian Medical College as a medical teacher, and later I joined my private practice. तो मैं मैसेज यही देना चाहती हूँ कि मैं ये देख रही हूँ कि कोरोना टाइम में we have lost so many of our medical colleagues. कितने डॉक्टर्स को हमने खो दिया है. और मुझे लगता है मैम, एक बहुत बड़े सेंट ने मेरी जो फीलिंग है, जो मैं हर वक्त महसूस करती हूँ कि बहुत प्रेशियस लाइव्स हैं, वी डोंट हैव टू, इनको लूज होने से बचाना है, इनको जाने से बचाना है हमने इन प्रेशियस लाइव्स को. तो मैम, उन्होंने सेंट ने कहा कि जो हमारी आध्यात्मिक शक्ति है या आत्मा की शक्ति है, इसका बहुत बड़ा इन्फ्लुएंस है हमारी इम्यूनिटी पे. तो मैम, मैं ये मैसेज देना चाहती हूँ अपने सभी डॉक्टर कोलीग्स को कि अगर वाकई ही हमारी आत्मा की शक्ति का इतना बड़ा इन्फ्लुएंस है हमारी इम्यूनिटी पे, तो मुझे लगता है कि आज सभी डॉक्टर्स को कहीं ना कहीं इस डायरेक्शन में भी अपने आप को डेवलप करना होगा. और
thank you very much, Prabhjot ji. Dr. Prabhjot, I think combining scientific treatment with the faith and power and belief in a higher self within us, and that ability to heal and reach out, is so important. Thank you so much for being with us. And to our last speaker, my dear friend, Dr. Dasmeet, who has very, very recently gone through a horrendous experience and is still recovering, as I understand. Over to you, Dasmeet.
Thank you, Nilima, and thanks to all my fellow panelists who are all great friends of mine. Uh, well, my main message which I want to give is basically it's not about COVID and about the neurological deficits which I experienced, almost like went up to paraplegia, and then how I was managing. But the main message what I can see is that from all
You have to tell us all what happened.
yeah, I'll come back to
Yeah,
it.
I don't think everyone knows. I know, but I think everyone would want to
Yeah,
get COVID. But you're such a dedicated-
I'll come back to that. I just want to make a starting comment that what I see from everybody's presentation is the fact that kind of a religious or a spiritual streak has helped each and every one person, and my own belief is exactly the same. You know, before I actually start what exactly happened to me, I also want to tell you that the most difficult part of dealing with COVID is the loneliness that one feels. I think one of the panelists has already uh, talked about that. Basically, the story started where it's about 50 days now, where I got 2 days of sore throat, and the third day I started experiencing a left-sided foot drop. And once I got that sore throat, the throat was exceedingly dry. So I knew that, okay, this is one, good chance that this might be COVID. So I immediately at home, I started wearing a double mask, and I decided, okay, I'm going to go and get my COVID test done. So that was done. I went to my OPD. I finished up my OPD. But by the time I could see that the neurological deficit was climbing. Okay, so it had started off with a foot drop, and the whole day then I showed to my fellow colleagues, the infectious diseases consultant and the neurosurgeon, and they decided after examination that no, this is something very odd. It's not behaving like a COVID, but definitely something is very odd. It's a neurological affliction. So they got an MRI done, and MRI of the first the lumbar spine, then the sacral and spine, and then the thoracic, and then the cervical, and even the hip joint. But it was MRIs were normal. Subsequently, I got my report by evening. So the day had passed, and it was decided, okay, fine, let's wait for the COVID report, and then we'll see what is to be done. So I drove back home. Fortunately, it was my left leg, and having an automatic car, I was able to drive with my right foot. So I drove back home. Meanwhile, the report came that I am COVID positive. And then by the time my left knee and left hip had also become weak, and even walking was like with great difficulty. So I had to take support of either the wall or the chair to move around. And so then my wife would, then I decided, okay, I must get admitted. So I went and got admitted. And being a senior consultant in Jahangir Hospital, they said, no, no, you go and get admitted in the private room. So I said, fine. So the sixth floor was reserved for the private room, all the COVID patients. So I went up there, and by the time I went, even my right foot had dropped, and so I knew, okay, this is something which is progressing rapidly. And then they decided, let's get a neurologist involved, and almost a team of about 10-15 people got involved from various parts of Pune. That this is something very, very odd. It is COVID, but it is behaving very, very differently.
Very
So
unusual.
very unusual. So the HRCT of the chest was also done, that the scoring was just 1 out of 25. So they were not also, so it wasn't really affecting my lungs that badly. There was no respiratory symptom, no fever either. And except for that sore throat and occasional cough had developed by then. By the time I was taken up in a wheelchair to the private room, my right leg was almost like, totally affected. So when I had to get onto the bed, get off the wheelchair and onto the bed, I realized that the problem is much bigger than what I had anticipated. So this is all happening within a matter of hours. So now to get out of that wheelchair and go into the bed. So my mind has already started working. Okay, fine. So supposing if this is transverse myelitis, or supposing if this is something which is not reversible, then what? So my mind, being an innovator in biomedical sciences, have already started working. Okay, fine. If I design a machine which can, elevate the legs and, it can just slide onto the bed and all, it'll become so much easier for paraplegics and other people, or even for me. Then my mind was also working on how to design a wheelchair. Now, supposing if I have to get back into the theater, what kind of a wheelchair should be there, which will help me to, conduct the operation. So, I mean, that just shows that basically I'm a very, very positive person. So my mind was already working on that. What the final diagnosis had not yet been made. The next whole day was, by various tests were done, nerve conductions and CSF. And after all that, it was decided that it is basically Guillain-Barré, but it has presented in a very, very different manner and COVID induced. Anyway, so now comes the tough part. Okay, fine. So day one, the diagnosis is made. It is decided that IVIG will be given, and that IVIG will be given. But before that, remdesivir had to be given, because otherwise after that it would not act very well. So depending on their plan, the treatment started. Now, when IVIG was to be given, the first day they had only 5-gram bottle, because it's not something one keeps in stock. But they had a complete course. I needed 30 grams. So 600 ml of that IVIG had to be given. So first they just tried to give it normally. And I could see that the dialoflow, the IVIG was so thick that it wouldn't cross that dialoflow at a good pace. And because of that, treatment, I mean, the IVIG which was supposed to be given over 6 hours, I could see that there's no way it can be given over 6 hours. The first bottle itself took about 2.5 hours, 100 ml to get over. So then what I started doing was I used my other hand and I started, on the soft part of the tube, I started making it like a peristaltic wave, which would push
Manual
that IVIG.
pump.
Yeah, so I made a manual pump. I said, okay, whatever happens, I have to get that IVIG into my system. So by some method or the other, okay, the 2 bottles went, the third bottle went, and the 3 more bottles were left. Then I told the sister, you do one thing, you get a 20 ml syringe, okay, you aspirate it and you inject it to me. Don't worry about the pain and whatever it does, I'll bear all that. So then that's the last 3 bottles were given that way. That was the day 1 of IVIG.
This is the point Madhuri had made. Being doctors, we at least understand and we can get timely help or intervention.
Exactly. Okay. Then the next day they decided, no, it's better to get a peristaltic pump and we'll give the IVIG with that. The other problem is that once that bottle gets over, the blood starts coming and then it gets blocked. So that the blood doesn't, and they had already finished changing 3 intracats by then, and they couldn't see my veins very well. And so I said, you do one thing. So even today, if possible, you just push it in. Although it becomes extremely painful, it's a very thick solution. But I say, you don't worry about the pain. I wouldn't tolerate. I mean, I wouldn't worry too much about the pain. So I just used to remember, what my gurus have gone through and how much of pain they have tolerated. I said, this is nothing. Let me just do it. Let me get that IVIG into my body. Whatever happens. Okay, fine. So that day, then I could not sleep, because the minute I would sleep, that 100 ml would get over and then the intracath would get blocked. So after that, I stopped sleeping. I said, okay, because the sister had to come and change that bottle, and by the time she would come and change that bottle, it would get blocked, because there's absolutely no other help. You have a few sisters, you have a few mamas, few maushis. By the time you press the pedal, by the time they come, the blood is already clotted.
I think you'll have to give a quick abridged this thing, but you're absolutely right, and we understand now what happens to patients.
Yes. And
yeah, I think all the stories so far are telling the doctors want to see it from the patient side.
From the patient's perspective. What I'm trying to show you is from the patient's perspective, it's a very, very different thing. Now, I'm not in an ICU setup, and I'm in a private room, but receiving, like, except for the ventilation part, the remaining treatment I'm receiving is, like an ICU treatment. Now, when that syringe pump comes in, it was not a syringe pump, it was the other peristaltic pump. So the sisters also, because they had not worked in ICU, so they did not know how to operate that. So I had to operate it myself only. So I was only feeding it in, feeding in the values. Okay, fine. In this 2 hours, I want this thing going.
But through all of this, you remained positive attitude.
Yeah. Okay. Now coming to the loneliness part. So see, once that used to happen towards the evening, what does one do through the day? Okay. Now, CSF had been done. So the minute I got a very bad post CSF, post spinal headache. So the minute I would try to get up to eat something, I would get such a splitting headache that I would just have to lie down. Now in the lying down position, you can't eat anything. So I told them that you give me liquids, and which I can have with a straw. And they used to find it very funny. The dietitians just couldn't understand that I'm unable to sit and eat. Anyway, so that was done. Now the spending of time, I thought, okay, now IPL is going to start in the next 2 days, so it's okay. So that will make it more interesting. But when you try to look at any screen, it is horrible. First of all, you have news channels where people are just shouting away, and in a state of mind where you're a patient, it's terrible. So I have recommended that there should be patient-friendly channels which should be relayed in a hospital. And then I think the only solace which you get is from a clock. Okay, so the second hands, like I had a clock right in front of me. The second hands, when it is moving, it tells you that the time is passing. Okay, and then the hour hand, like you say, okay, fine, now I'm feeling sleepy. Every activity is extremely tiring. So like you eat a little bit of food, or you drink a glass of coconut water, and you're tired, then you want to sleep. You lie down, you close your eyes, you sleep. And when you get up, that hour hand has moved hardly 1 hour or 1.5 hours has passed. So the only thing which so that wasn't a very friendly thing for as far as a patient is concerned. So the only friendly thing I found was the minute hand. Second hand would only tell you that time is going by, but the minute hand would tell you, yeah, okay, fine, there is some pace to the time going by. The hour hand would not move. TV was completely useless. Mobile was completely useless because eyes would get tired. The only solace was that some messaging which I got. And where I'm coming back to the point where where I started, I started getting messages from a lot of my classmates. So one of them said that मैं तो आज मस्जिद जाने वाली हूँ, मन्नत मांगने वाली हूँ. Another one said कि मैं आज वो स्पेशल महालक्ष्मी टेम्पल जाके मैं 100 चक्कर मारने वाली हूँ. Different people. Many James Nilima knows. So she said, I'm going to go to the church and pray. So all these things, becomes so much of positivity and so much of support that it just helps you to, overcome all that. Third day onwards, my power started. Yeah. So both the faith that, there's so much of spirituality. I had done a lot of donation work for the Sassoon COVID hospital. I raised almost 2 crores worth of donations, and so I was very active in that. So everybody said that is that all these things have come together as a blessing. And then the third day onwards, once my power started coming back, then I knew, okay, fine. I told the neurologist also, I think I'm going to be absolutely fine. And over a period of time, I've made a decent recovery. I'm almost 90% recovered. I've started my work. I've started surgeries also. So so coming back, that I think that having a faith in something is extremely important. Having and all the speakers have talked about that. That having people as a support system is extremely important, and having a family with so much of power in them, with their ability to give you a positive vibe for everything, That is extremely important. Having good doctors who take care of you at such a point of time is very important. The entire healthcare system comes together. Within 18 hours of my admission, my first IVIG was given. And even people from the US said that we would have taken about a week to do all these number of tests, which happened in just 18 hours. So it's a blessing, and one must learn to appreciate that there are certain things which are blessings that we should learn to appreciate them.
Thank you so much, Jasmeet, and I'm so glad to see your, cheerful attitude and positive which you've shared with us all. And I think today's whole this thing has been a very moving experience sharing with you all. But I think we can end on being very proud that we are all doctors, we are human, we still believe in God, and that all of us have a huge support system that we can be proud of. Thank you so much.
Let's give a standing ovation to, or a sitting or standing ovation to all the speakers and all these wonderful people. And I think even in our audience, there'll be many others whose story has not been shared. But this was nothing short of 8 mini TED Talks, I think.
Yes.
Inspirational, motivational, and so positive. God bless you all. All the best. Let's give a Shaba Khair.
Thank you so much for this opportunity.
Thank
you. Great. Everyone, thank you so much for sharing your stories. And as usual, I must thank Dr. Nilima for putting this session together. And please have this video, like you said, there'll be lots of doctors who can take solace from that. We are a team. We are in this together. Thank you so much.
Thank you, General Venkatesh. Thank you, Dr. Madhuri. Thank you, Dr. Ravi. And thank you, all the wonderful audience for being with us. And anybody who